In today's episode, I have the pleasure of hosting Abby, a political psychologist who is also dyslexic. In this episode, Abby shares her journey and discusses how dyslexia has influenced her life and work. We explore her unique perspectives on politics, her experiences with dyslexia, and how she has overcome challenges to achieve success. Tune in to hear from Abby and gain valuable insights into the fascinating world of political psychology. Welcome to NeuroDiverse Voices, Breaking Barriers and Embracing Differences. This series explores the intersection between culture and neurodiversity with a focus on amplifying the voices and perspectives of individuals with neurodiverse traits or conditions. It aims to promote greater understanding and acceptance of neurodiverse individuals and communities and to empower them to share their stories and perspectives with the world. Hi, Abby. Welcome to Nourish by NBNPodcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, Abby, tell us a little bit about your experience with neurodiversity and how it has impacted your life.
Yeah, sure. So I have dyslexia, and that affects your brain pretty broadly. The one most people know about is issues with reading and spelling and that kind of thing. I had pretty bad issues with reading when I was younger. I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was about 6, and I couldn't really read properly until I was about 10 or 11. I got specialized help. I was super lucky because I was diagnosed young and I got good support. And so I am able to read very well right now. But my dyslexia does still affect me in other ways, primarily the ways it affects executive functioning. So that's, I'll miss little details occasionally, or I'll reverse two numbers if I'm dialing a phone number, or I can't remember people's names, like that sort of thing. Being a little bit more absent-minded than the average person, I would say, is the primary way it affects me now. Oh, and I can't take dictation for the life of me.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think it, and I'm sure we'll get more into this later, but I don't think it's all bad, right? Like, especially with the positive aspects, it's hard to tell, what's the dyslexia and what's just me, right? Because I've had dyslexia my whole life and I will have it my whole life, right? So it is the part of me. But there's the creativity element, the big picture thinking, the out of the box thinking, I think, to some extent is related to my dyslexia. And I consider myself reasonably good at that.
Yeah, sure. There are some classical signs about dyslexia that you just described about missing out on the finer details, making more sense on the broader aspects of things or considering the whole aspect of things as such. And yes, dyslexia does have a genetic basis. So you're born with it and it continues through your life.
Exactly.
So through your schooling, can you describe, not even just schooling, but also through your career path right now, can you describe some strategies or accommodations that have been helpful for you?
Yeah. So I would say the main thing that's had the biggest impact on my life was like immediately as soon as I was diagnosed, my parents and the school I was at, which at the time was a Montessori school, got me specialized tutoring. It was a mix of Wilson and Orton Gillingham, which are both programs I'd recommend from my own personal experience. It was really intensive tutoring. It was tough to go through at such a young age, like working that hard academically as a really little kid, which not that many people necessarily have to do. But it was absolutely worth it, because just getting to that point where you can read and you can read with confidence and read well is a huge thing, right? In the rest of my life. Like there are some dyslexics who struggle with reading their whole lives and are still incredibly successful in everything. But for what I've done with my life, if I continued to struggle with reading the whole time, that would have been a real barrier for me. So the fact that I was able to get to the point where I could read well meant a ton. There were sort of continuing struggles, and still to some extent are, after I learned how to read well, because there's this real tendency, even among people who really mean well, to be like, well, if you have dyslexia and you can read well, that means you don't have dyslexia anymore, or you never really had dyslexia, or it doesn't really affect you in any way anymore. And so there wasn't necessarily perfect support for everything that I really needed. So the main accommodation I had after being able to, after learning how to read, and this is the accommodation I had like in middle school and high school, and then on through college and my master's, although college and my master's sort of everyone has this accommodation, which is that I'm able to use a computer. I didn't have to write
Oh,
anything by hand in basically any context. I wasn't required to do that. My handwriting's not very good. I think technically I was like semi-diagnosed for an educational setting with dysgraphia, but I actually think that may have been a misdiagnosis because I can draw quite well. I'm actually pretty good with my hands most of the time. So, but my handwriting is pretty bad, at least when I try and write fast. Unfortunately, the way that the school system worked where I grew up, just having dyslexia was, at least at the time, not enough to get an accommodation to use a computer, which in my opinion is really stupid. And I should clarify, this wasn't even to use speech to text or anything. This was literally just to type my assignments, which in the modern world is like what everyone does anyway, most of the time, right?
and you should have been given that accommodation because it was a need for you.
Yeah, exactly. But I was eventually given that accommodation, which was great and really helped me because I can type so much faster than I can handwrite, especially neatly. And it's got the built-in spell check, which is a huge help because I'm not great at spelling. Right. So that's great. The unfortunate thing is that there are a lot of people who surprisingly didn't respect that accommodation, even though it was written down in what should have been legally binding documents. The absurd thing is, okay, so I'm going to go on a digression about another thing here, which is it drives me crazy. There are like, I have not found any specialized programs for teaching dyslexics foreign languages, and foreign language learning is super tough with dyslexia. So what they did for me and for a lot of other kids with disabilities is they just told us, we'll take American Sign Language. It's easier and you don't have to write anything. And I think American Sign Language is a beautiful language and it's amazing. And it was really cool to be able to learn it. Being sort of shunted into that path because of my dyslexia is something that I don't approve of. But the crazy thing is, in that class, my American Sign Language teacher, who taught us about the Americans with Disabilities Act in class, would not let me type on tests a lot of the time. And I'm like, if I have invented a piece of technology that can capture American Sign Language motions and then turn them into English sentences from a computer camera, I don't just deserve to pass this class. I deserve like a Nobel Prize. Like, how would I even cheat on this test using a computer? But people are really suspicious. Like, if you're seen as like smart and like you're not really seen as disabled, a lot of the time people think that what accommodations you have, are you trying to get a leg up? You trying to be unfair? That kind of thing, which is like totally not what I was looking for, right? I was just looking to be able to demonstrate what I had learned in an accurate way. And then the other I had, this was years ago, but yeah, I think biology. So we had to turn in our lab notebooks and have them graded. I always struggled when I was in high school with when they were grading our process or our note taking rather than our final product, because my note taking is not great and tends to be very unconventional, but I'm usually able to produce a pretty good final project. So being graded on my note taking is really difficult because it's sort of being graded on your thinking process. And if your thinking process is abnormal, right, that's the problem. But this wasn't even the problem in that specific instance. In this instance, it was that she wanted them all written out in a very particular way. But I had a accommodation to type, right? So I typed them all up and I was like, yeah, and I'll hand them in. And even like we had to draw the graphs by hand. And I'm like, I'll draw the graphs by hand. I just need to type the text.
Yeah.
And she just like wouldn't hand them back and wouldn't give me feedback for like months on end. Eventually she would give me grades with them, but she just wouldn't give me feedback. She was also just really, really mean to me, like interpersonally. And I think part of it was that she resented having to do anything even a tiny bit differently because of my dyslexia. Yet she was so mean to me that one of my classmates had her dad find my mom's phone number and call so that my mom would know what was happening to me.
Wow.
Like, yeah, no, that was crazy.
Like years back, it was a different situation, I think. Totally.
Yeah. Although I'm
Less
not that
awareness.
old, right? You know, I'm 25.
Yeah.
I would have been like, so this was like 10 years ago,
Yeah.
maybe less. Yeah. So, yeah, it's definitely unfortunate. College was mostly better. The thing is, in college, right, like you get to type everything anyway, except for some exams. So the university knew that I got to type everything and it wasn't a problem. And what was I going to say? The only issue I had is part of the executive functioning stuff is I have a little bit of difficulty following directions sometimes. I jump to different conclusions. than other people would, which is great for like creative thinking, but is not great when you're trying to like exactly meet a rubric, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes I would ask for clarification on the directions, and I would mention my dyslexia, right? And I did have some teachers, including psychology teachers, who really should have known better, because one of my undergrad is in psychology and modern history. So like half my classes were psychology classes. And I had teachers who were surprisingly unwilling to be accommodating to that. And they were like, well, if I had to explain it extra for you, I'd have to do that for everyone. And I'm like, that's great. Explain it extra for everyone. Like, is there, because I don't think having to be confused by directions should have to be part of the learning process, right?
Sure.
So there were some issues with that. Professionally, it's not that bad, other than like copying over large bits of information or taking dictation or anything like that. I've been very lucky in that basically everyone I've worked with has been incredibly willing to accommodate those issues, because they've been incredibly small amounts of my overall responsibilities. And this has only ever come up in roles where there are other people with my exact job who can take on that responsibility. Although I will admit that like there's like 2 instances professionally where my dyslexia has come up. And it is like a stressful experience for me having to admit that I can't do something, or that I can't do something as efficiently as someone else. Like, I don't like having to do that, but I also don't want like an important task to be done badly or too slowly because of my dyslexia, right?
Yeah, but again, there are also some strengths. If there are some challenges, there are
Oh
also
yeah,
some strengths
definitely.
as well. But before we jump into the strengths, I wanted to ask you about how has dyslexia influenced your approach to problem solving and creativity?
Yeah, it's funny, I don't know how to approach those things as a non-dyslexic person, because
Yeah,
I've been dyslexic my entire life.
yeah.
But I will say that I do sometimes think of solutions that other people don't think of, which I think is good. And in terms of creativity, I'm pretty like artistic. I like to make pretty graphics and stuff for things, and I find that is easier for me than it is for a lot of other people. And also I do some needlepoint and geometric designs, and I'm able to keep track of, and I also do them on graph paper sometimes. I'm able to keep track of those designs in my head in a way that other people seem to find baffling, but is like quite easy for me most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, your strengths definitely point towards, the concept of mind strengths. So where it's like M stands for the material reasoning or mechanical reasoning. So, you
Yeah.
can visualize those. If you're
Yeah.
building a huge
Yeah.
construction, you would visualize that in your brain.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, if I hadn't gone into social sciences, I would have wanted to be an architect, actually.
Yeah, yeah, and then the I stands for like interconnected reasoning, where it's like you can easily connect relationships or, give different points of view or think from a different point of view,
Yeah.
as such, or even narrative reasoning, where you're really good at storytelling or you wouldn't
Yeah.
be fearful of public speaking. So a lot of
Oh,
strengths do
yeah.
coincide where you're telling me about.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty good at public speaking. I think part of that is because growing up, not being able to read, and growing up in a household where intelligence was very highly valued, verbally was sort of the only way I felt like I could demonstrate my intelligence.
Yeah, yeah. And it's like people would usually think like, because I mean, for people who are not aware about dyslexia, having problems with reading and spelling, but having this ability of public speaking and speaking without
Yeah.
fear and speaking really in a very well narrative way is a strength,
Yeah.
as such. So
Yeah, and I've been told, because I'm a pretty decent writer at this point, I've been told that I write like I speak. And I think that's because when I read, I hear the words in my head, and when I write, I hear the words in my head. And I think that's part of the reason I can't take dictation, but it's also one of the reasons why I find writing in a conversational tone to be sort of the easiest form of writing for me.
oh, yeah, makes sense because if you're writing in dictation, your brain is thinking what you are saying as well, and
Then
in
it gets all,
information from outside, so it gets all
yeah.
jumbled up. Makes
Yeah.
sense. So, have you found any particular resources or support networks that have been helpful?
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm. I mean, resources like, like I mentioned, Wilson Orton Gillingham when I was
Technology.
younger, huge, very, very important. But like, I don't know, it's interesting. Like, I don't really feel like I've necessarily found that much of a support network. Although I will say, so I joined Reddit in order to promote my YouTube channel, which I'll talk about later. And I did join the dyslexia subreddit. And I mean, it's a subreddit, right? So it is to some extent going to be a mixed bag, but I have found it generally to be a really good community and something that would have been useful to me earlier in life. I haven't necessarily gotten like a lot out of it for like just me personally, but I feel like I've been able to put back other things for other dyslexics and like parents of dyslexics and like sharing my experience and that kind of thing. And also just like commiserating about like, oh yeah, I've dealt with that too, you know? And I found that to be like really nice, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And have you ever felt the need of missing support, or you were able to easily cruise through life?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was tough not being able to read as a kid, obviously, but like it's more like frustrations with not being given the support that I'm supposed to receive rather than support that was like completely missing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, like I have had struggles in my life after, you know, the difficulties of learning how to read when I was like 10, but they've mostly not been like super dyslexia related.
Sure.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, why do you stay behind a mask?
Yeah. So that's because in one of the jobs I do in my day job, I have to contact literally thousands of people, including from my LinkedIn profile, which has my face and that kind of thing. And for that job, it's probably a good idea that very personal things about me, like my dyslexia, but also because I talk about politics and do express my own opinions on my YouTube channel, it's good to just sort of keep that separate so that if I'm contacting someone at some company or some organization, they're not going to look me up, find the YouTube channel and be like, well, I disagree with her about gun control, so I'm not going to answer this completely unrelated survey or thing. I will say that my day job has to do with like climate issues and that sort of thing, but I really can't give like more details than that. It's a compartmentalization thing. Also, I think it is, you know, it is occurring to me, this is, I think, the first like public interview I've ever really given about my dyslexia. And it occurs to me that it's also probably good to keep that a little bit separate because some of the weaknesses I have mentioned are things that could theoretically affect me professionally. And I don't necessarily want people to find that when I'm applying for jobs and be like, well, she mentioned she can't take dictation. I'm not going to hire her for this.
But that shouldn't be the case. You know,
Yeah, no, it shouldn't be the case, obviously.
we are
And
living in an
actually,
equitable world now. So,
yeah, no, and I actually am, what was I going to say? I am actually in an interesting position where most of the people I work directly with do actually know about my YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel has actually kind of helped me get both of my current jobs because they're both in social science and they're like, oh, she does social science stuff in her free time. That's cool and good. But there's still a certain amount of compartmentalization that's useful because both the stuff I do with YouTube and the stuff I do professionally are both public facing. And so it's just keeping two separate public personas, essentially.
yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit, as much as you can share, about your background and how did you become interested in political psychology?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from a suburb of Boston. That's where I'm from. And I would say that I became interested in political psychology. And this actually does tie into my dyslexia because I always knew that other people were different than me and that people think differently. And I think I was especially aware of that from a very young age because I essentially knew I was neurodivergent from a very young age, right? Although, of course, you know, I'm now in the area of psychology that is sort of farthest from the area that focuses on dyslexia specifically. Although it would be interesting to do some work on how dyslexia might impact political opinions or political action.
Yeah, that's a good topic.
Yeah, no, it is a good topic. I should do some research. Anyway, so yeah, and then I was also just really interested in people generally. I was super into history and I got interested in that because I was super into mythology as a kid. And then I sort of became politically active and politically aware starting around like I'd say age 10, I would like watch The Daily Show and The Colbert Report and that kind of thing. And then I was the student representative to the school committee when I was in high school and started getting more involved in like activism stuff when I was in college. I think I started out in college sort of wanting more to apply the psychology lens to like historical events. And I'm still a huge history nerd. And I think that work, having studied history, like does still inform a lot of what I do now. But I started getting more interested in applying it to political things and especially climate things. So when it came time to leave college, I was like, okay, I'm going to go do a master's in political psychology. And that's when I started my YouTube channel. I think I actually released my first video like the same week that I started my master's. Yeah, because I already had some grounding in, in social psychology from my undergrad and that kind of thing. So it wasn't based on what I learned in the first week of my master's, because what you learn in the first week of your master's, well, in my case, it was a lot of COVID precautions because I did my master's in 2020 to 2021. Yeah. And my first video was actually about the pandemic too. It was about anti-lockdown protests. Yeah. So that's sort of how I got interested in political psychology. Yeah. And then I sort of drifted away from academia, but kept doing the YouTube channel. And then I realized sort of bored at work and drifted back in towards more academic-y things in my day job too. But that's not necessarily permanent. But I think I do want to keep doing like research and communication stuff long-term in my day job, in addition to YouTube.
Sure. So you have your hands full with your day job and the YouTube.
Yeah, I actually have 2 day jobs too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's only 5 days a week though. I work 4 at one and 1 at the other at the moment.
Okay, I was about to say, like, do you work 60 hours a week?
No, I work like 37 hours a week plus YouTube. So it's not too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell our viewers a little bit about what is political psychology.
Yeah, sure. So political psychology is the psychology of politics. And what that means is it's the psychology of why people vote for certain candidates, support certain causes, view different social groups in different ways, how they can be motivated or unmotivated to engage in certain political actions, that sort of thing. So it's applying the study of things that are studied in psychology, like personality or temperament or group dynamics, to the political realm.
Mm-hmm. So what does your work with political psychology entail? Like, I know you have a YouTube channel, but like, what do you do as a political psychologist?
Yeah. So technically my day job stuff is like behavioral science, but it's there's a lot of overlap. The answer is surveys mostly in that, but there are a lot of other things that you can use political psychology for. And like I said, I can't go into a ton of detail about my day job. For the YouTube channel, what I mostly do is research. I'll come up with a question, or one of my viewers will ask me a question, and then I will find out what I can from the scientific literature about it, write a script about that, make visuals, talk into a microphone, and then, edit it all together into a video. But obviously, most people with a background in political psychology are not spending any of their time doing video production. So I'm sort of an unusual case there.
Yeah. I mean, sort of like me. I started this I'm an occupational therapist, and I have started, apart from my clinical work, I've started this podcast,
Yeah.
which people rarely do. But
Yeah.
so your surveys, by surveys, you mean you try to understand human minds, how different people think, or different patterns of behaviors, and map them out?
Exactly. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, what are the main psychological factors that influence people's political beliefs or the voting behavior?
Oh, well, I have a whole video about this, which is like 20 minutes long. So I won't go into everything, but I'll say personality is a factor. Self-interest is also a factor. I mean, a lot of the time that would be more covered by political science than political psychology, but there's definitely overlap. So yeah, self-interest is a factor, but I think a lot of the more psychological factors come into play when self-interest is unclear or people are acting against their own self-interest. So, but morality and the way people's morality varies and doesn't vary, and the way it's influenced by culture and environment, that's a huge factor in politics. And then I would also say like group dynamics and group identity and the way individual and group identity intersect. That is like a huge driver, especially for movements as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So, just out of curiosity, do political psychologists also work in coming up with strategies or strategizing the voting, elections,
Yeah,
election
no, that
campaigns?
Yeah, no, that is something that some people with political psychology backgrounds do. And a lot of the people who do that would hopefully, read the work of political psychologists to inform what they're doing. And actually a big part of why I do what I do is to try and get that information out there in a digestible way to activists who may not have the resources to like hire a high-priced consultant to help them with their political cause.
Mm-hmm. Sure, does make
Yeah.
sense. So, how do emotions such as fear or anger would play a role in shaping political attitudes or
So
maybe any
yeah,
decision making?
Yeah, no, so emotions are really big. So one of my earliest videos, I stand by the research, don't stand by the production quality, was about the role of fear in the gun control debate. And that's one where fear plays a pretty big role because a lot of the time, people who are like super into having guns for self-defense are disproportionately afraid of being the victims of violent crime, even though demographically there's nothing to suggest that they would be, right? Like people who own guns for self-defense are actually disproportionately members of groups that are not typically targeted for violence and live in fairly safe areas. Yeah, so that plays into it there. Interestingly, like that sort of feeling that the world is dangerous doesn't really play into it on the gun control side, although I think that there's some indications that, being afraid that you will be in a mass shooting is, a motivator for supporting gun control. And then, I mean, it plays into it in a lot of other places. I think a lot of prejudice is, anger that has been directed at a particular group, sometimes because of real suffering that isn't that group's fault in a lot of cases, right? Like scapegoating, right?
Yeah.
And I think fear is also a big one because we find that fear of a dangerous world, so basically the belief that like the world is an unsafe place and other people are out to get you rather than help you, is a very big factor in a lot of conservative attitudes. And this can come into play on things like immigration, right? Like the belief that immigrants are going to hurt you, that ties into fear of a dangerous world, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, Abby, can you talk about any interesting research or case study you've come across with the intersection of politics and psychology?
Oh, sure. I mean, loads. I mean, it's just going to be difficult to just think of one for a sec because I referenced, a dozen or more under each video. Well,
We'd love to know, a few interesting
yeah, no,
ones.
there was an interesting one I came across when I was doing my video on the intersection between benevolent sexism and the abortion debate. So I think I have to explain what benevolent sexism is first, otherwise this won't make any sense. So benevolent sexism is essentially attitudes towards women that don't seem overtly negative, but that still have the potential to impact them negatively and restrict them. So like the idea that women are inherently better at housework than men is benevolently sexist, right? Because it's not intrinsically an insult to women, but it can be used as a justification for like women should stay home, they should have careers as much as men shouldn't be expected to pick up as much housework, that kind of thing,
Exactly,
right?
yeah. Yeah, I was going to get into that topic a little bit later, but now that we are in, let's
Yeah.
discuss it.
Yeah. And so the original video I did about benevolent sexism, I realized that I hadn't included any discussion of the abortion issue in it. And especially given how, topical that issue is, I realized that was an oversight. I actually realized it was an oversight because I was teaching a class on political psychology this summer to a bunch of high schoolers. And on the first day, they asked me, like one of the students asked me, are we going to talk about the abortion issue? And I'm like, we probably should.
Yeah.
And that was a little difficult because I had to figure out how to cover it in an age appropriate way there. But I ended up doing a video about it. And one of the key studies I found, which unfortunately I don't remember the citation for right now, was generally about benevolent sexism and abortion attitudes. And I think it was about some other psychological constructs around abortion attitudes as well. But they did find really interestingly that being opposed to what they class as traumatic abortions was especially linked to benevolent sexism. What they class as traumatic abortions are actually instances where the need for an abortion arises from trauma, I would say, more than the abortion itself is traumatic. It's sort of a confusing name. It would be situations where the woman is a victim of rape or or
I was
there's a
thinking more
medical
of injury, but
or there's a medical problem with the fetus or embryo, like that kind of thing. So like situations other than, where there's some sort of circumstance other than the woman is pregnant and doesn't want to be pregnant, right? Like there's an additional thing there. And opposition to abortions in those scenarios is actually especially linked to benevolent sexism. And that's because there's this idea of who women are and who women need to be as this like sacrifice. The term they use is sacrificial mothers. This idea that women are essentially built to suffer nobly for their children, even if these hypothetical children have no chance of surviving and leading good lives. So it's really interesting. And benevolent sexism ties in as well to elective abortion, opposition to elective abortions, but hostile sexism ties in more there because there's a general idea that essentially it's the idea that women are sluts, essentially, is the opposite. A lot of the opposition comes from there, and that attitude is hostile sexism. And what was I going to say? Yeah, no, and it's really interesting because there's also, coming from benevolent sexism, this, what I find to be a genuinely disgusting idea that women need to be protected from making the decision to have an abortion, even though, rates of regret for abortion are very, very low.
yeah.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, this is a really interesting topic, actually.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like you mentioned about earlier, like there it is maybe put it out in a positive way, but it's still, in a way, as an insult to women. As
Yeah.
an indirect insult to women, I would
Yeah.
say.
And it's not even so much about the insult, right? It's about the
The
real
right.
material harm, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So nowadays there's a lot of misinformation or spread
Yeah.
of disinformation, in terms
Yeah.
of politics. What is your point of view on that and how to combat such issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say. And misinformation, I should say, is like not something that I've delved into a ton. It's not like something I'm really specialized in, but I do have my own opinions about it that I'm willing to share. But, caveat there. What I will say is that I see a lot of both sidesism in people's approach to misinformation, like the idea that, oh, everyone's in their echo chamber and the misinformation from the left is just as bad as it is from the right. That's not what the literature indicates. There is misinformation from the left or from the center, but a lot of misinformation, especially very harmful and prejudiced misinformation, is coming from the right. And so I think that encouraging people to look for balance as a way to counteract misinformation may be not the right approach. I think people need to be taught to look for truth rather than balance, but that's difficult, right? I think that, if you're a TV station or something, you have to be bolder to outright call one of your guests, if they're a prominent politician, a liar, rather than just to have two people representing two sides of an issue. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there aren't two valid sides to every single issue, right? Like, if you're talking about climate change, you don't really need to listen to climate change deniers, right? That kind of thing. So in terms of like my general advice to people in terms of like countering misinformation in their own lives is look at sources, figure out where things are coming from, figure out how this information was gathered, figure out what the interests of that news source are. If it's coming from a think tank, try and figure out who's funding them, that kind of thing, right? Yeah. So I mean, that requires effort, but I think a lot of people are willing to put in that effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially it comes up more during election campaigns, right? Like how you mentioned about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the prejudice information being more from the
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, no, I would definitely say, I mean, I think people's engagement with politics in general. Oh my God, my phone just fell off the desk. It's not important.
Are you sure you can grab your phone?
No, I'm sure it's totally fine. Anyway, so yeah, no, I mean, people's engagement with politics in general increases during election years. So I think that engagement with misinformation
Mhm.
also increases during election years, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There is a general bias among people that we tend to be more doubtful of information that goes against our pre-existing views.
Mm.
There is some evidence from studies that if you encourage people to think about being as accurate as possible, that counteracts it a little bit. So just like having that mental frame does counteract it a bit. In terms of fact checking, I'm not like against fact checking at all, but it is unfortunate that there does tend to be a certain amount of backfire effects. So for some things, if you tell someone that something they believe is wrong and even present them with evidence, it'll actually just entrench that incorrect belief. And there's also some evidence to indicate that that tendency is stronger on the right.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Sure. So,
Yeah.
like, how can political leaders or policymakers use insights from political psychology to improve the communication or bridge the gap between different groups of people?
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. What I would say is emphasizing common identity can be useful in some instances, whatever that shared identity and sense of community is, right? So like, a politician who's, from a town will want to play up the identity of that town,
Mm.
and perhaps how people from a marginalized group still can be part of that identity in a positive way. There is some issue though where we're all the same mentality can maybe, and that the literature on this is sort of mixed, may undermine actions by certain marginalized groups in order to, achieve better lives for themselves. So there is a difficult balancing act there. I would say that, and I would also say not scapegoating is, of course,
Yeah.
very, very important. Of course, that does mean, right, that a lot of politicians will then have to admit, who is actually to blame for certain societal ills, right? And sometimes that is their campaign contributors. So that is difficult.
Sure, but you did bring up some really good points
Yeah.
about having like a shared identity or a common identity and
Yeah.
such.
Yeah.
So we are
Oh, and
almost
I was
towards,
going to say
yeah.
one more thing on that point, which is emphasizing everyone's humanity is important. Because a lot of prejudice and division comes from dehumanization.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe the regional divide.
Yeah. But basically, making sure that everyone knows that everyone else involved is also a person, I think is very important. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to like bring up, personal stories in a lot of instances that'll resonate with people better than statistics,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Although of course statistics are more useful than personal stories in actual policy making. It's just a question of communication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are almost towards the end of our show. What would be some key takeaways or insights that you hope people will gain from your work in political psychology?
Yeah, sure. What I would say is get involved in your community, figure out where you can have a positive impact and focus on that, and figure out what skills you can bring and focus on that. It's good to keep up with what's going on in the world, but it's more important to have the impact you can have in the world than to know exactly what's going on at all times. You don't have to be checking your news scroll all the time. That's not necessary. And also what I was saying before, focus on finding truth and finding information that's going to help make you a more informed citizen that'll be useful in, figuring out who to vote for and figuring out what to do with whatever time you have to devote to your community.
Yeah, so searching for more credible information as such and just
Yeah.
unbelieving any speaker. So, just out of curiosity, do you intend to, or is it somewhere down your pipeline to go into politics or, go into like these strategizing election campaigns or things like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I don't know. So I don't necessarily see myself running for office, at least not like high office. Like I might consider like the level of like alderman or town meeting or something down the line, but I don't see myself ever running for like Senate or something like that. Because I just don't want to be like constantly in the public eye in that sort of way. What was I going to say? But in terms of working for campaigns, I have worked for campaigns in the past and I would again. I'm not sure I necessarily want that to be like my primary career path. I think primarily because of the work culture. I don't think it really necessarily gels with me perfectly. It can be very chaotic, very irregular hours, that kind of thing. Also, to sort of get on the ground floor of that, a lot of the time you just have to call a ton of people, and that's something that I find kind of personally exhausting. But I do see myself like advising campaigns and working for lobbying groups and that kind of thing. That is something that I see myself being involved with. So I definitely see myself being involved with politics personally and professionally in the long term. But other than maybe sort of consulting for them both informally and formally, I don't see myself necessarily doing that specifically with like election campaigns.
Sure.
But I don't know, I'm 25, it could change.
Yep. Well, Abby, it has been such a fun time having this interesting and informational conversation with you, learning about some new concepts, new terms. It's been really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great talking with you.